The sun had barely risen as Sarah stepped out of her front door. The air was crisp with a light morning fog hanging low over the yard. She hesitated for a moment, looking around the quiet neighborhood. A kind of stillness that usually followed an early morning was now pierced by the sharp sound of a lawnmower in the distance. It was the sound of her neighbor, Miss Jenkins, the one everyone called the HOA. Karen. Sarah had seen her before, the woman with the too perfect hair and a demeanor that suggested she had never let a rule slip through her grasp. Miss Jenkins had been watching her every move ever since she moved in a few months ago today. Though Sarah was determined to ignore her and focus on her own chores, the house was starting to feel like home. At least the outside of it was, but inside, the stress of the moving process lingered like an uninvited guest. The weight of boxes still packed and waiting to be sorted threatened to overwhelm her in the coming days. And she didn't need any distractions today, especially from Miss Jenkins, who had already given her more than enough unsolicited advice about the rules of the Homeowners Association. As Sarah knelt down to trim some overgrown bushes by the sidewalk, she noticed Miss Jenkins approach, her hands on her hips, and that familiar air of disapproval surrounding her. Sarah sighed and stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She didn't want to engage, but it seemed unavoidable. Mrs. Jenkins wasted no time in getting to the point. "Do you know your sprinkler system isn't working properly?" she said in her usual condescending tone. Sarah blinked at her, confused. "I haven't had any issues with it," she replied. But Miss Jenkins was already peering past her shoulder at the sprinkler heads along the yard. "Well, they're obviously not working. If the grass is turning brown here," and she pointed at a patch near the curb, "you'll probably get a fine if you don't get that fixed immediately," she added, as if it was a certainty that Sarah had no choice but to comply. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, Miss Jenkins was already moving on to her next point. "Did you know there's a rule against leaving your hose out overnight? You're supposed to store it properly in the garage or shed," she continued, her voice dripping with authority. Sarah's frustration was growing, but she managed to keep her cool. Miss Jenkins was like this every time, and it wasn't like arguing ever helped. It only made things worse. "I'll take care of it," Sarah said as calmly as she could, and started to turn away. Miss Jenkins, however, wasn't done yet. "I'll let you off with a warning this time, but next time I won't be so understanding," she added, as she walked away, leaving Sarah standing there in the growing morning heat. Her hands were clenched into fists as she watched Miss Jenkins walk back to her house like she was some kind of queen, having just delivered an edict. That was when she noticed something strange, the sound of water running, and she looked back toward her yard. The sprinklers had come on without her touching them. Water was spraying everywhere in all directions, but nothing was being watered. The system had gone haywire. Sarah's heart sank, and she rushed toward the sprinkler controls, frantically trying to turn them off. But the water kept flowing in all directions, flooding the yard. She had no idea what had happened or why, but the more she tried to stop it, the worse it seemed to get. Sarah was in a panic now. Water was gushing from the sprinklers, creating small rivers that began to flood the floorboards and spill over onto the sidewalk. She tried to turn the control dial again, but nothing changed. The water kept coming. The ground under her feet became soft and slippery, the grass turning into a muddy mess. The sound of rushing water filled her ears, drowning out everything else. As she ran around in circles trying to find a way to stop it, her thoughts were frantic and all over the place. Was this a malfunction? Had the system somehow broken? She knelt down beside one of the sprinklers, trying to twist it by hand, but it didn't budge. The pressure behind the water was too strong, and before she knew it, her shoes were soaked and her clothes were sticking to her skin. She could hear the sound of a car approaching, and she looked up just in time to see Miss Jenkins pull into her driveway in her pristine sedan. Miss Jenkins didn't look like she was in any hurry. She didn't even seem to notice the flooding at first. She slowly got out of her car and walked toward her front door, as if everything was normal. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the woman who had once again become the center of her frustrations. This time, though, there was no way she could pretend everything was okay. She was about to yell when Miss Jenkins turned around, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene in front of her. Sarah could see the realization dawn on her face. But Miss Jenkins didn't move right away. She stood there studying the flood, as if it were a science experiment. She didn't even offer a word of help, just watched as the water continued to pour into the yard, with no sign of stopping. Sarah's blood was boiling. What was she going to do? This wasn't just a small issue anymore. This was a full-blown disaster. She could hear Miss Jenkins muttering something under her breath, and that only made her more furious. "Is this your idea of getting attention now, Miss Jenkins?" said her voice sharp, her lips curling into a disapproving frown. Sarah blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me," she gasped. "No, this isn't something I did. It's a sprinkler system. It malfunctioned, or something." She was getting louder with each word. But Miss Jenkins didn't seem moved. She shook her head slowly. "That's not how it works, you know," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You've probably tampered with it. And now you want to blame someone else." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could anyone be so cold? How could she stand there and accuse her of something like that, when it was so obvious that the situation was out of control? Sarah turned back to the flooding yard, her heart racing. As she realized there was no way she could stop this alone, she needed help, and fast. Just as she was about to run inside and grab her phone to call someone for help, she heard Miss Jenkins' voice again. "If you don't fix this soon, there will be consequences," she said. And with that she turned her back and walked into her house, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the mess, with no one but herself to rely on. Sarah stood frozen in place, her mind racing as the water continued to spill across her yard. Every second seemed to stretch longer as the flood spread further and further. She could hear the sound of it rushing down toward the curb and the street, the water pooling in the gutter, like a small river carving its way through the neighborhood. She didn't know what to do next. Should she go inside and call a plumber, or maybe even the city, to shut off the water? But what if they couldn't get here in time? The thought of all the damage that could be done was overwhelming. The thought that she could be responsible for all of this was terrifying. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. Maybe there was something she could do herself. After all, she had some experience with these kinds of systems back when she lived in her old house. She had dealt with the sprinklers a few times in the past. She didn't want to rely on anyone else to fix it, especially not Miss Jenkins, who seemed more interested in assigning blame than offering help. With a new sense of determination, she rushed to the control box where the sprinkler system was managed. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to steady herself as she flipped the switch, trying to turn off the water. Nothing happened. The water kept flowing faster and harder, as if mocking her efforts. She cursed under her breath. The dial was too tight. The system was locked somehow. She couldn't get it to respond. Then she had an idea. Maybe she could manually turn off the individual sprinklers. She ran around to each one, lifting the heads and twisting them to shut off the flow of water. But it was no use. They were all still pumping water out like there was no tomorrow. With the flood rapidly expanding, she could feel the panic rising in her chest. She had to act quickly, or else the water would start to seep into the house. And that was a nightmare she wasn't ready to face. She ran back to the control box and tried again, this time pulling out the manual from the drawer and flipping through the pages. It was hard to focus with all the noise of the water splashing around her. But she couldn't give up. She found the troubleshooting section and followed the steps carefully. First, she tried to reset the system by turning off the main water supply valve. But even that didn't work. Her frustration mounted. And just as she was about to give up, a thought crossed her mind. What if Miss Jenkins had done something to the system? She couldn't be sure, but she had a nagging feeling that this was no coincidence. Miss Jenkins had been on her case about the sprinklers for weeks. Now had she somehow sabotaged it out of spite? She thought about the woman's cold demeanor, the way she seemed to take pleasure in her misfortune. Maybe it was a stretch, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Her heart raced as she glanced around the yard at the ever-growing flood. She was running out of time. Maybe there was still someone who could help her, someone who could fix this before it was too late. But who could she trust now that Miss Jenkins had made everything so complicated? Sarah's mind raced as she looked around in desperation. The flood was spreading faster, now creeping dangerously close to the foundation of the house. She could feel the mud underfoot as it softened with every second. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had always taken care of her yard, kept things tidy, followed the rules. So why was this happening to her now? She shook her head, trying to focus. There had to be a way to stop it. But her thoughts were scattered. The water was becoming a torrent, no longer just flooding her yard, but also running along the sidewalks, the streets starting to fill with the force of it. It was like a small river, had opened up right outside her door. She needed help. And fast Sarah grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she searched for anyone who could help. She called the first plumber on the list. But there was no answer. She tried another. But the line was busy. Panic started to claw at her throat. She couldn't do this alone. She needed someone with experience to fix it before it caused real damage. Then she remembered something. Her neighbor Mike, who lived 2 houses down. He was a handyman and always seemed to know how to fix anything from plumbing to electrical work. He had helped her once when a light bulb went out, and she figured he might be the only one who could help now. She didn't have time to hesitate and rushed out toward his house, hoping he would be home. As she approached Mike's front yard, she saw him working on his car. Under the hood, his usual easygoing smile was on his face. But it faltered when he saw Sarah rushing toward him, all out of breath. "Mike, what's wrong?" he asked, standing up from his work. Looking concerned, Sarah didn't have time to explain the full story. She just pointed back toward her yard and said, "Please, you have to help me. The sprinklers are out of control, and I can't stop them." Mike's eyes went wide, and he immediately grabbed a wrench from his toolbox. Without another word, he followed her down the street at a fast pace. He must have seen the look of panic in her eyes, because he didn't ask any questions. As they reached her house, Mike took one look at the flood and cursed under his breath. He moved quickly to the control box, assessing the situation, his hands working with skill as he twisted the valve and turned some dials with precision. Sarah stood by anxiously, her eyes on the water that was still gushing from the sprinklers. Mike seemed focused, but it felt like hours passed before he spoke. "Okay, I think I found the problem," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I can fix this, but I need you to go inside and get me some towels to soak up the water in the house while I work out here." Sarah nodded without hesitation, rushing inside. As Mike worked to stop the flood, she grabbed every towel she could find in the house and ran back outside, her mind racing as she tried to control the growing sense of dread. She knew that if Mike didn't fix this soon, the damage would be much worse than she could handle. Mike worked with surprising speed, moving between the control box and the sprinklers, twisting knobs and turning valves. Sarah watched from the sidelines, her heart pounding in her chest as the water continued to pour out. The flood was creeping closer to her doorstep, and the thought of it getting inside the house made her stomach twist with anxiety. She could hear Mike muttering to himself under his breath, occasionally pausing to examine something closely. He seemed to know what he was doing, but even he was starting to show signs of frustration. After what felt like an eternity, Mike finally stood up from the sprinkler system, his hands on his hips. "Okay, I think I've got it," he said, turning to Sarah. His face was a little grim, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I've turned off the main water supply to the sprinklers, but there's still a lot of water that needs to drain out before this mess can be controlled. We'll need to move fast, or it'll keep spreading." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and nodded. "I'll help however I can," she said, as she looked over at the flooding yard. The water had already reached the sidewalk, and now it was pushing into the street, threatening to spill over into the neighbors' yards. Mike didn't hesitate. He started pulling out a few tools from his bag and motioned for Sarah to grab the garden hose. She quickly followed his lead and grabbed the hose from the side of the house, hoping that maybe with some teamwork they could drain the water faster. As Mike moved to the street to direct the flow, Sarah sprayed the remaining water that was collecting near the foundation of the house, trying to move it toward the drainage ditch that ran alongside the street. They both worked in silence for a while, their efforts frantic as they tried to keep the flood from getting any worse. Sarah's arms ached from the effort, but she didn't dare stop. She couldn't afford to. Her house and her yard were on the line. Everything depended on getting this under control before it was too late. Mike glanced over at her a few times, nodding when she managed to get the water to move in the right direction. They made progress, but it felt like they were fighting a losing battle. The amount of water was overwhelming. No matter what they did, the flooding wasn't slowing down. It was hard to tell how long they'd been at it, but Sarah's entire body felt like it was on fire, and exhaustion was starting to set in. Just as she was about to suggest they take a break, Mike spoke up. "Hey, we might need to bring in some heavy-duty equipment for this," he said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "I don't think we're gonna get this under control without a pump." Sarah felt a jolt of fear At the thought of bringing in more help, she had no idea how much that would cost or how long it would take to fix. She didn't want to burden anyone else. But at this point, it was clear they were running out of time. She took a deep breath and nodded okay. What do we do? Mike gave her a reassuring look. Don't worry, I've got a few friends who can help us. I'll make a few calls. But you need to keep an eye on the yard and try to keep the water from going any further into the street. I'll be right back, he said before rushing off toward his house, leaving Sarah alone again to face the disaster. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. Everything seemed out of control. Sarah stood alone in the yard, the sound of rushing water filling her ears as Mike disappeared into his house. Her heart was still racing, and her mind felt like it was in a fog. She glanced at the flooding yard once again. The water had started to creep into the neighbor's property now too, and she could hear the distant sound of sirens in the background. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control. She tried to keep the water from flooding further into the street by using the hose, but it was like trying to hold back an avalanche. No matter how hard she worked, it seemed to be getting worse instead of better. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. As she looked at the mess around her, she couldn't help but think about the conversation with Miss Jenkins earlier that morning. That woman had practically accused her of doing this on purpose, like it was some kind of scheme. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and took a shaky breath. Why was she letting Miss Jenkins get under her skin like this? She needed to focus on the problem at hand, not waste any more energy on someone who seemed to get joy from causing trouble. She turned back to the yard and adjusted the flow of water, trying to guide it toward the ditch where it could drain away. She was so focused on the task that she almost didn't hear Mike returning. But when she heard his footsteps, she turned around quickly and saw him walking back down the sidewalk, a grim expression on his face. He was talking to someone on the phone, his brow furrowed as he gave directions about getting a pump over to the house. Mike hung up the phone as he reached Sarah. The news wasn't good. The pump will be here in about an hour, he said. But I need you to hold the line a little longer. I'm going to grab a few more tools to keep this under control. While we wait, Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her shoulders. But she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Mike seemed to understand and immediately got to work. He moved quickly, pulling a long extension cord from his truck and setting up a small water diversion system to try to redirect the water away from the street. It wasn't perfect, but it helped slow the flow. Mike's movements were quick and efficient, his experience showing in the way he handled everything. Sarah watched him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She could see how much he cared about helping her, even though she knew this was turning into a bigger problem than either of them had expected. As Mike continued to work, Sarah glanced back toward her house. The water had finally stopped creeping toward the door, but it still remained dangerously close. She wanted to run inside, check on everything, but she couldn't leave the yard unattended. The thought of coming back to find her house flooded was enough to keep her focused on the task at hand. She tried to focus on the small victories. She was managing to keep the water from doing any more damage for now, but it felt like a constant battle, one that would only end once the pump arrived and the rest of the water was drained out. She could only hope that Mike's plan would work, that they would be able to fix this before anything worse happened. Time seemed to stretch on as Sarah and Mike worked together in the growing chaos. The water was still slowly creeping toward the street, and though the diversion system Mike set up helped, it wasn't enough to stop the flood completely. Sarah was exhausted. Her arms ached from moving the hose and trying to redirect the water every few minutes. But she knew they couldn't stop now. She glanced at the sky. The sun was higher now, and the heat was starting to become unbearable. But there was no time to rest. Mike was focused on keeping the situation under control, his movements quick as he adjusted the hose and checked the control system again, his eyes constantly scanning the yard for any sign that the flooding was worsening. He seemed calm, but Sarah could tell that even he was starting to feel the pressure. Just as she was, Mike looked over at her and gave a quick nod, as if silently reassuring her that they were making progress. Hang in there, he said. It won't be long before the pump gets here. We just have to hold it together a little longer. Sarah nodded back, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the pace. It felt like hours since the flood started, and every second felt more and more like a race against time. She tried to stay focused on the task ahead, trying to keep the water from overflowing But it was a losing battle. She could see the water level creeping up again. And she felt her stomach tighten with fear. She was scared that everything was going to get worse before it got better, that the pump wouldn't be enough, and she'd end up with a completely flooded house. She shook her head, trying to clear the negative thoughts away, and focused on Mike instead. He seemed to be making progress with his setup. He looked at her again with a determined expression. "You're doing great. Just stay with me for a little longer," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. She tried to smile back at him, though it felt more like a grimace. She had no idea how much longer they could keep this up. When she heard a car pull up to the curb, her heart skipped a beat. Mike glanced up, and his face lit up as he saw the tow truck that had just arrived there. It was the pump. Sarah exhaled in relief. It wasn't over yet, but this was a huge step toward getting the flood under control. The driver of the truck stepped out and immediately got to work, unloading the heavy equipment. Mike walked over to him, quickly exchanging a few words. Before he turned back to Sarah, "The pump is here," he said. "We're almost there, just a few more minutes, and we can get this whole thing drained." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude. She wanted to thank Mike for everything he'd done, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded and gave him a tired smile, the weight of the situation still heavy in the air. She watched as Mike and the driver worked to set up the pump and hook it up to the system. With quick and practiced movements, they had a plan now, and the relief that followed was almost overwhelming. She could see the water beginning to slow its rise, and for the first time since the flood began, she allowed herself to breathe again. The worst was over, but the job wasn't done yet, and she wasn't going to relax until everything was under control. As the pump rode to life, Sarah could feel a wave of relief wash over her. The sound of the machine working to drain the water from her yard was almost like music to her ears. The water that had been threatening to swallow up her home and spill over into the street began to recede slowly at first, but steadily. The steady hum of the pump filled the air as the flow of water started to slow. Mike stood beside the driver, offering instructions, while Sarah kept an eye on the yard, making sure nothing else went wrong. The tension in her shoulders slowly started to ease as she watched the water level drop inch by inch. Mike was still focused on the pump, making adjustments here and there to ensure it was working properly, and Sarah couldn't help but admire his calmness in the face of everything they had been through. It had been a long few hours, but they were finally making progress. Sarah felt the exhaustion creeping in now that the immediate crisis was over. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was starting to wear off, and she could feel her legs trembling with the strain of standing for so long. Her whole body ached, but she didn't dare sit down yet, not when there was still work to be done. Mike turned to her, after a while, his expression softening a little as he saw the toll the whole situation had taken on her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Sarah nodded, though she didn't know how convincing it was. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, her voice hoarse from all the yelling and talking over the noise of the water. Mike didn't push her, he just nodded and went back to checking on the pump. The water was almost gone now, the soggy earth slowly returning to a more manageable level, and Sarah couldn't help but let out a long breath of relief. It was almost over. The damage wouldn't be as bad as she had feared. Though the yard was still a mess, the water wouldn't be there to ruin everything anymore. She glanced around at the scene. She had just witnessed the flood that had felt like an unstoppable force was finally under control, but it left behind a trail of destruction. Sarah's eyes wandered to the sidewalk, where small puddles of water still collected, and the muddy stains that covered the yard from the sudden onslaught. She had no idea how long it would take to get everything back to normal, but at least the worst of it was over. Mike approached her again, wiping his hands on a rag. After finishing with the pump, the driver gave him a thumbs up, signaling that the job was done, and the machine had done its job. The water had been pumped out of the yard. Mike gave Sarah a weary smile. "You did great," he said, and for the first time she could see the exhaustion in his eyes too. "I think we're in the clear now." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, and nodded, looking down at the yard. The damage was still there, but now it seemed manageable. The water had been contained, and the flooding had stopped. She had made it through the crisis, and though the road to recovery would take some time, at least she wasn't facing a total disaster anymore. As Mike made a few final checks on the equipment, Sarah stood silently watching the yard slowly returning to some semblance of order. She was grateful for Mike's help. But there was still a part of her that felt unsettled. The ordeal wasn't over yet, not completely. But for the first time, since this all began, she allowed herself to feel a small glimmer of hope things would get better soon. As Mike finished up with the pump and made sure everything was turned off and properly secured, Sarah stood there in the middle of her yard, still taking in the aftermath. The water had drained away, but the damage was still evident. The grass was a muddy mess, the flower beds were ruined, and there were patches of standing water in places that she had no idea how to deal with. Her mind felt heavy as she surveyed the destruction. But at least the flood was over. At least her house hadn't been damaged. She could handle the rest. It would take time, but she would make it work. Mike wiped his brow and turned toward her, giving her a sympathetic look. "You know, this could have been a lot worse," he said, his voice calm but sincere. Sarah nodded as she glanced at the floodwaters that had receded. The whole experience felt like a blur now. The panic and fear that had taken over her, every thought was fading, leaving only the exhaustion and the mess she had to clean up. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It could have been much worse. Her house was dry, and the yard would recover, even if it took time. "Thank you, Mike," she said, her voice tired but filled with gratitude. "I honestly don't know what I would have done without you." He gave her a tired smile. "No need to thank me. I was happy to help," he said, and turned to gather his tools. "You've been through a lot today. I'm just glad we got it under control. You should probably get some rest, and let me know if you need help cleaning up." Sarah watched him walk back to his truck for a moment before looking back at the yard. She didn't know how long it would take to get everything back to normal. But Mike was right. She needed rest. She had been running on adrenaline for hours, and now her body was finally starting to tell her that it had enough. She slowly made her way inside her house, taking in the quiet. After all the chaos, the water had stopped rushing, and the noise of the pump had faded. But there was a stillness that felt unfamiliar. After everything that had happened, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. It felt surreal, as if she had just woken up from a nightmare that was somehow real. She closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself a deep breath. She had survived the flood. Her home was safe, and despite everything, she was still standing. But now, the real work began. Getting her yard back to its original state would be a long and tiring process, and she had no idea how she was going to deal with the mess. But for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a small moment of peace. She could do this. She just needed time. Sarah made her way to the couch and collapsed onto it, her body screaming in protest. But she didn't care. She had done it. She had made it through the worst of it. She was going to be okay, even though the damage was still fresh and the task of recovery loomed in front of her. She knew that she had the strength to tackle it one step at a time. For now, though, all she needed was a few moments to rest and recharge before she could start picking up the pieces again. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling like she had been hit by a truck. Her body was sore from hours of non-stop work, and her mind was still a little foggy from the chaos of the day. Before she rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly, the sun was just beginning to rise, and the house was quiet, but the sight of the mess outside reminded her that she had a lot of work ahead of her. The floodwaters were gone, but the yard was still a disaster. The grass was a patchwork of mud and waterlogged plants, while the flower beds looked like they had been through a wall. But as Sarah stared out the window, she felt a sense of determination rising in her chest. She could fix this. It would take time, but she was going to make her yard beautiful again. The thought of calling in professionals crossed her mind, but she didn't want to spend the money. She had already been through enough over the past day. She decided she would do what she could on her own, and if it became too much, then she would ask for help. But she wasn't going to give up so easily. Sarah made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table to plan her next steps. She needed to clear out the dead plants and debris before she could even think about replanting new flowers. The sprinkler system would need some repairs, and there was still a part of her yard that had flooded more than the rest. She would have to figure out how to manage that and hopefully prevent it from happening again. At least the weather was on her side. It was a clear day with no rain in sight, giving her the perfect opportunity to tackle the mess outside. She finished her coffee and grabbed a pair of gloves and a shovel. She wasn't sure where to start, but the first step was obvious. She walked outside and immediately got to work pulling up the waterlogged plants and debris from the flower beds. Each movement felt slow and laborious, but with every plant she cleared she felt like she was making progress by midday. She had cleared most of the mess out of the flower beds, and was starting to replant new flowers. She had a few pots of plants she had kept in the garage, and some seeds that she had been saving for a rainy day, but they would do for now. The dirt was still soft from the flooding, and it made planting easier, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for everything to grow back. It was going to take a while, but she knew it would be worth it by the time she was done for the day. Her hands were dirty, her back was aching, and she felt like she had barely made a dent in the work that needed to be done. But she didn't feel discouraged. If anything, the work had given her a sense of purpose and a break from the emotional whirlwind that had been the past 24 hours. She looked around at the progress she had made and realized that she was capable of much more than she had given herself credit for. It wasn't going to be perfect, but the yard would recover in time, and so would she. The next few days passed in a blur of digging, planting, and fixing the broken sprinklers. Sarah worked steadily through the mess. Little by little her yard began to take shape again. Though it was a long road ahead, she knew she had the strength to see it through to the end.